We're going to do a class that was suggested by a number of questions that came up. And in the future, we hope to have some kind of ongoing, maybe every week, every other week, or third week, whenever we have an opportunity, discussion groups, which won't necessarily be formal, but will allow people to ask questions and have discussion on either current events or questions around socialism, communism, revolution, Marxism, really whatever folks have in mind. So this is really the first, and it was suggested by some questions because the ultra-right-wing news commentators were denouncing one of our folks, and in doing so they were denouncing communism and fascism. They're both the same. Right. And so the question came up, well, what really is communism and what is fascism? How do they differ? Do they differ? And how do they differ? And how could they get away with saying that if they differ so much as we believe they do? And then also we thought we'd add in, if we have time this evening, some discussion of the nature of the Tea Party movement, which in my view has a whiff of fascism, but what cannot be classified at this point as a fully developed fascist movement. But we'll talk about that, you'll see why. What I'd like to do is start off talking, my name is David Soul, we'll start off talking about communism, try to get a, and in no way will this be a decisive presentation about communism, that would take quite a while, but just to give a general idea of what it is, where it came from, and then a little bit about fascism. But what we're going to do for fascism is we've got some readings, just about 3 or 4 pages, from Trotsky's The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany, which was written prior to and then just after Hitler's seizure of power, when the question, could he be stopped, was on the minds of everyone, and who could have stopped him, and the Communist Party, the socialist parties of Germany failed to do so. So we'll see a little bit about that to help us understand what is fascism and also how to fight it. Communism is the ideology of the working class. It did not pop into someone's head abstractly. It emerged in the middle 1800s when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, looking at the previous socialist writers, because socialism as an idea, egalitarianism, equality, really goes back, if you want, to biblical times. And read the New Testament, you can see elements of socialism. But even in the 17 and early 1800s, socialism was what we call utopian socialism. And it really didn't project scientifically what socialism and communism were, how it could develop, and who could carry out a revolution for this equality. Marx and Engels, co-thinkers, co-workers, starting in 1848 with the writings of the Communist Manifesto, started the movement for scientific socialism, which put it on a very much higher level. And again, this wasn't something they just sat around philosophized about. They took the ideas of the French socialists, utopian socialists, and analyzed them. They took the best works of the English economists, even though they were capitalist economists. Ricardo had already discovered the labor theory of value. That is, that it's workers who give value to things, objects that they mold with their hands and machines. And they also took the best of philosophy from Germany, and were able to synthesize those three, what Lenin called 3 sources and component parts of Marxism into a scientific theory. They also based themselves on observation that in the 1830s, for the first time, the working class in a country, England, got up on its own feet with its own demands. And they fought, it was the Chartist movement, and they fought for demands in their own name and with their own party. So that was a big contribution. That's why we say it's an ideology of the working class, because it shows how capitalism emerged from feudalism, the French Revolution, the Cromwell Revolution in England, overthrew an old system, established a more economically progressive system, and that a new class, the working class, which was emerging from the Industrial Revolution, could and would carry out an overturn of the capitalist class to really liberate the economy from private property, capitalist profit motive, and really take the amazing developments in industry and science, make them available for the benefit of all people. And that's what communism was. And they developed that word communism specifically to have a more thorough rejection of utopian socialism. So up to that point, socialism had been kind of philosophers, lovely ideas, but with no plan or idea of how to apply it or what it meant in reality. And that's where the word communism comes from. Now, having said that, socialism and communism are often used interchangeably, sometimes by some people who have no problem with that. We do that sometimes. The early socialist parties were based on Marxist ideas. They were sometimes called social democratic parties. But the idea, these parties, when the First World War broke out in 1914, a war that had been predicted and all the parties had pledged to fight, they all caved in except a few and supported their own capitalist governments and led millions and millions of people to slaughter for nationalism and capitalist conquest. And then socialism or social democracy became a little bit of a pariah among those who were opposed to imperialist war, opposed to capitalism, and the name communist parties became more known, and a whole international movement of communist parties was born, starting with the 1917 Russian Revolution. And the Bolshevik or Russian Communist Party was the main party that opposed the war, did not participate. They all went, the leaders all went to jail or underground for opposing that imperialist war. A few other countries were opposed to it also. And then, so at that point, socialism was considered by communists to be the reformist, moderate sellout movement. Communists were the revolutionaries. And then another problem developed that no one could have foreseen. The revolution in Russia in 1917 did not spread as hoped for. Well, it did spread, but it failed. The Hungarians had a communist revolution in 1919. It was overthrown with German and other troops. Parts of Germany had a revolution. They threw out the king, but they were not able to develop a socialist or a communist society, and it fell back. Even though the socialists governed, the capitalists still ran the country. And the prospects for a revolution dimmed in Europe, which was the most developed at the time. And Russia was kind of isolated with their communist or revolutionary government. And in addition, they had just fought a civil war for 6 years, and a bureaucracy developed. A bureaucracy that was based on this revolution, but was not really interested or had any confidence in world revolution, and basically was interested in maintaining its own privileged positions. You might compare it to a union that starts off really revolutionary, like the sit-down strikes in the 1930s, but after years and years, a bureaucracy sets in, high-paid officials. They don't necessarily fully represent the workers. They may fight some grievances, but they don't stop plant closings as we see today. And so the UAW is very different from what it was when it began, Teamsters and others. But that bureaucracy developed fairly quickly in the Soviet, what became the Soviet Union. And by 1923, 1924, 5, under the leadership or crystallized around one of the Bolsheviks, Stalin, became really entrenched. And in doing so, entrenched meant that to protect itself, it had to get rid of anybody who criticized it. That's the nature of a bureaucracy. You don't criticize them, you don't rock the boat. If they tell you to go left, you go left. If they tell you to go right, you go right. If they tell you to go left and right, you do it.